The air inside the courthouse felt heavy, as if the very walls carried the weight of all the secrets and stories they had witnessed over the decades. The old wooden benches creaked under the shifting bodies of spectators who had come, not just for justice, but for a spectacle. This was no ordinary trial. Everyone knew that by the end of the day, something extraordinary might happen, something people would talk about long after the case itself faded from memory. At the center of it all was a boy, no taller than the judge's bench. Just 3 years old, he sat swinging his tiny legs nervously, clutching a battered red toy car in his hand. His hair was neatly combed by his mother that morning, though the cowlick at the back stubbornly stuck up, a reminder that he was still just a child, far too young to be seated among lawyers, officers, and strangers in suits. His wide, curious eyes scanned the room, pausing often on the high windows where light poured through dusty glass. Whispers rippled across the courtroom like a restless tide. Some leaned forward eagerly, notebooks ready, reporters scribbling headlines before the moment even arrived. Others shook their heads, skeptical, muttering that bringing such a young child into a courtroom was irresponsible. Judges rarely allowed it. Lawyers almost never suggested it. But here he was, a toddler in the middle of a legal storm. The case had already stretched for weeks. The accused, a man with a long criminal history, stood at the defense table, his jaw tight and eyes fixed on the boy. He had claimed innocence from the very beginning, insisting that he had been wrongly identified. His attorney repeated the same words over and over: lack of evidence, unreliable witness, mistaken identity. The jury had listened, but their uncertainty lingered. Everyone knew this trial had reached a point of tension that facts and evidence alone could no longer untangle. And so, the boy had been brought in. Some called it desperation from the prosecution. Others called it brilliance. But most agreed on one thing. This child carried something no one else in that courtroom could. An unfiltered memory of the night. Everything had gone wrong. The boy's mother sat close by, wringing her hands, her eyes darting between the judge and her son. She had resisted at first, terrified that exposing him to the weight of such a setting might scar him. But the prosecutor had convinced her that sometimes truth came from unexpected places. Sometimes innocence was the clearest lens through which justice could be seen. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney smirked, confident that a child this young could never hold up under questioning. He's barely out of diapers, he had scoffed during pre-trial motions. What could he possibly add besides confusion? His tone had dripped with disdain, as if the very idea of listening to a toddler was laughable. But the judge had surprised everyone. Let the boy speak, he had ruled, his voice steady, commanding respect. If he is the witness the prosecution claims, the jury deserves to hear him. And so now, the stage was set. The bailiff's voice rang out, sharp and clear. Call the witness. All conversation ceased. The room fell into a silence so deep that even the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder. The boy froze for a moment, clutching his toy car tighter before his mother gently nudged him forward. His small shoes tapped softly against the polished wooden floor as he walked toward the witness stand. Each step seemed magnified, like drumbeats echoing in the hearts of those watching. He climbed awkwardly onto the chair, his little legs swinging back and forth as he settled in. The judge looked down from the towering bench, softening his stern expression for just a moment. "Hello there," he said, voice quieter than usual, as though speaking to his own grandchild. The boy looked up, blinking, and whispered a faint "Hi." A ripple of warmth moved through the courtroom. Even the jurors, who had been stoic and unreadable for weeks, shifted in their seats, their eyes softening. For a moment, the harsh, cold air of the trial seemed to melt away, replaced by the fragile presence of childhood. But underneath that innocence lay the reason everyone was here, the truth only he could provide. The prosecutor stood slowly, adjusting his tie, his movements deliberate so as not to appear intimidating. He smiled, though it was a careful smile, not one of pity, but of reassurance. "Can you tell us your name?" he asked gently. The boy hesitated, then gave it, his small voice echoing through the microphone, perched awkwardly in front of him. His words were simple, but they carried more power than anyone expected. The defense attorney scoffed audibly, drawing a stern glance from the judge. But even he couldn't deny the gravity of what was happening. A child, barely old enough to form complete sentences, was about to become the most important voice in the room. The boy fidgeted with his toy car, spinning its tiny wheels against the wooden surface of the witness stand. His eyes drifted across the courtroom, pausing on the jurors, the lawyers, and finally, the dog sitting quietly in the corner. Rex, the police canine. At the sight of the animal, his face changed. His lips curled into a shy smile, his shoulders relaxed, and for the first time since entering, he seemed less afraid. The dog, sensing the attention, lifted his head slightly, ears perked. It was a small connection, almost invisible to most, but it was there, a thread between child and protector, woven tightly in the aftermath of terror. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady. "Now," he said, leaning forward slightly, "can you tell us what you remember?" The entire courtroom leaned in, breath caught in anticipation. Some believed the boy would freeze, overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. Others believed his memory would falter, blurred by fear and time. But no one, absolutely no one, was prepared for what he would eventually say. Months before the boy ever stepped foot in the courtroom, the town had been rattled awake in the dead of night. It was one of those small, tightly knit communities where people rarely locked their doors, where children rode bicycles until sunset, and neighbors waved at each other from porches. But on that night, the illusion of safety shattered. The sound of shattering glass broke through the quiet suburban street. A masked man crept inside a modest home where a mother and her son were sleeping. He carried a crowbar in one hand, his intentions unclear, but dangerous enough that every step he took left behind a trail of menace. The boy, startled awake, crawled from his bed and padded softly down the hall, searching for his mother. He was too young to fully understand fear, but he felt it all the same, an instinctive alarm that made his heart race. In the living room, the mother froze as she heard the intruder's heavy footsteps. She clutched her son tightly, whispering for him to stay quiet. A masked figure advanced, his shadow stretching long across the dimly lit walls. What he hadn't counted on was how quickly the police would arrive. Neighbors had heard the crash and dialed 911. Within minutes, a patrol car screeched to a halt outside, and from it leapt a German shepherd named Rex, a veteran police canine with years of service. Rex's handler shouted a command, and the dog bolted through the open doorway like a streak of muscle and fur. His bark thundered through the house, sending the intruder into a panic. The man swung the crowbar wildly, but Rex lunged, teeth bared, forcing him backward and away from the mother and child. In that moment, the boy peeked from behind the couch, his wide eyes catching every detail, the glint of the crowbar, the mask, and the dog leaping to protect him. To a toddler, the scene was overwhelming but unforgettable. Officers rushed in seconds later, wrestling the man to the ground as Rex growled, guarding the family. The boy's mother held him close, trembling as relief washed over her. Neighbors poured into the street, murmuring about what they had heard, what they had seen, and how close the family had come to disaster. It was a moment that would ripple through the town for weeks. But as the man was hauled away in handcuffs, the defense began to build its shield. From the very first interrogation, the intruder claimed it wasn't him. Yes, he had a record, Yes, he had been near the neighborhood, but he insisted he hadn't broken into the house. His lawyer echoed the words like a mantra, mistaken identity, and slowly doubts began to creep in. The evidence seemed strong at first. The broken glass, the mask found nearby, the fingerprints smudged on the crowbar. But defense attorneys are trained to slice through certainty. They argued that the police rushed the investigation, that Rex's actions made it impossible to know if the intruder had actually threatened the boy. They insisted the fingerprints were circumstantial, belonging to tools the man had touched elsewhere. The mask, they said, could have been discarded by anyone. Piece by piece, the defense chipped away, trying to create a cloud of uncertainty around what had seemed like an open and shut case. For the prosecution, the strongest thread of truth remained the smallest witness, the boy himself. He had seen it. He had heard it. His innocent eyes had watched the dog leap into action, protecting him from the masked intruder. The problem was simple but devastating. Could anyone take the word of a 3-year-old seriously? The town split in their opinions. Some said the child was too young to even recall what happened, that his imagination could have twisted the details. Others insisted children that age remembered more than people thought, and more importantly, they lacked the guile to invent lies. He doesn't know about strategy, one neighbor remarked at a local diner. If he says the dog saved him, it's because the dog did. Meanwhile, Rex remained the silent guardian in the background. He had no words to offer, only the weight of his actions that night. His handler testified about Rex's training, his years of service, his flawless record in dozens of cases. But even that wasn't enough for the defense, who argued that dogs acted on instinct, not truth. They pressed on, hammering away at the idea that the boy's testimony should never be admitted. In the quiet of their home, the boy's mother wrestled with guilt. Every time she tucked her son into bed, she wondered if exposing him to the courtroom was the right choice. He was happy again, playing with toys, drawing pictures, giggling at cartoons, but she knew the night of the break-in still lived inside his small memory. Sometimes she found him staring out the window, clutching his toy car, as if listening for the sound of glass breaking. Sometimes he asked, "Is the bad man gone?" She reassured him every time, but her heart ached knowing the truth was far more complicated. The prosecutor visited their home often, sitting at the kitchen table with files spread across the surface. He explained gently why the boy's voice was important. "We don't want to scare him," he told the mother. But no one else saw what he saw. "He doesn't need to understand the whole case, just tell what he remembers." The mother hesitated, torn between shielding her son and doing what was right. In the end, she agreed, not because she wanted him in that courtroom, but because she knew his words could mean safety for other families. The man accused of the break-in wasn't a stranger to crime. He had been in and out of trouble for years. If the case collapsed, he would walk free, perhaps to harm someone else. And so, the boy was placed on the path that led him to the courthouse, to the wooden bench where he sat with his feet dangling, toy car in hand. The crime that had begun in shadows now loomed in the bright light of justice, waiting for the smallest witness to speak. What no one could predict was how powerful that tiny voice would become. The morning of testimony began with tension so thick it seemed to cling to the very air. The courtroom, already heavy with the memory of the child's entrance, now became a stage for the fiercest arguments. At one table, the defense attorney shuffled papers with deliberate noise, his smug expression meant to rattle the prosecution. At the other, the prosecutor sat upright, hands folded, as though conserving every ounce of energy for the battle about to begin. Everyone knew the focus was not evidence today, it was credibility. Could the testimony of a 3-year-old child hold any weight in the halls of justice? Or would it collapse under the sharp edge of doubt wielded by the defense? The defense. Attorney stood, adjusting his dark jacket with a theatrical flourish before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice dripping with practiced confidence, "we are being asked to rely on the memory of a toddler, 3 years old." He held up 3 fingers, shaking them slowly in the air, as if the number itself was an insult to reason. "This is not a witness. This is a baby. A child who cannot distinguish between reality and make-believe, between nightmares and cartoons." Gasps and murmurs rippled across the room. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, while others narrowed their eyes at the attorney's tone. He pressed forward, pacing slowly. "Do you really believe that a boy who still sleeps with toys, who needs help tying his shoes, who has no concept of truth or consequence, can stand before you and decide the fate of a man?" His voice rose in pitch, the cadence carefully designed to stir doubt. The boy's mother clutched her son tightly from the gallery, her knuckles white, her lips pressed together to keep from shouting. She wanted to scream that her child wasn't confused, that he remembered everything with terrifying clarity. But rules silenced her, forcing her to watch while strangers debated the worth of her son's voice. The defense attorney paused dramatically, lowering his voice for effect. "I don't blame the boy. He is innocent, but innocence is not accuracy. You wouldn't ask a toddler for directions. You wouldn't ask him to balance your checkbook, and you certainly wouldn't trust him with the liberty of another human being. Yet that is exactly what the prosecution wants from you." He stepped back toward his table, chin high, certain he had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the jurors. The judge turned toward the prosecutor. "Your response?" The prosecutor rose slowly, his presence calm but deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood with a kind of gravity that demanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "the defense is correct about one thing. This is an unusual witness. Children this young are rarely asked to testify. But rarity does not mean unreliability, quite the opposite." He walked toward the jury box, his eyes meeting each juror's gaze. "Adults lie. Adults create strategies. Adults twist truth when it suits them. But a child this young?" He paused, lowering his voice. "Children don't plan lies. They don't weigh words with strategy. They speak with raw honesty. Sometimes clumsy, sometimes simple, but often more truthful than any of us care to admit." The courtroom grew quiet. The prosecutor pressed on. "This boy lived through something none of us can imagine. He saw a stranger break into his home. He saw the danger unfold. He saw a police dog save his life. His story is not invented. It is seared into his memory. And though his words may be small, their weight is enormous." The jurors leaned forward, listening now with new intensity. The prosecutor's voice softened, filled with conviction. "We are not asking you to treat him as a scholar or an expert. We are asking you to hear the truth spoken through innocence. And sometimes, innocence is the clearest lens of all." A hush fell over the room, broken only by the faint creak of wooden benches as spectators shifted. The defense attorneys. Earlier confidence flickered for the first time, his smirk dimming under the steady conviction of his opponent's words. A judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling an end to the arguments. "This court will allow the child to testify," he declared. The decision was final. The words echoed through the chamber like a bell, tolling the start of something momentous. The boy, seated quietly with his mother, looked up at her with wide eyes. He didn't understand the arguments, the grand speeches, or the stakes of the trial, but he could sense the weight of what was coming. His mother leaned down, whispering softly in his ear, "It's okay, sweetheart. Just tell the truth. That's all you have to do." As the jurors shuffled their notes and the attorneys prepared their questions, the atmosphere shifted. This was no longer about legal strategy. It was about a child stepping into a world meant for adults and carrying the burden of truth on his small shoulders. And in the back corner of the courtroom, Rex stirred, lifting his head from his paws. His deep brown eyes fixed on the boy, as if he too understood the importance of what was about to unfold. The defense had made their doubts clear. The prosecution had declared their faith. Now, the courtroom waited for the smallest voice to break the silence and tip the scales of justice. What no one could decide, at least not yet, was whether the truth would be heard as truth, or dismissed as the fragile memory of a child too young to be believed. The battle lines were drawn, and the next words spoken by the boy would either destroy the prosecution's case or seal the fate of the man accused. The courtroom had grown restless after the fiery arguments between the attorneys. The defense had tried to dismiss the boy's memory as a fantasy, while the prosecution urged the jury to see truth in innocence. But as attention swirled around legal arguments, one figure remained still, unnoticed by many, yet central to everything that had unfolded. Rex, the German shepherd, lay quietly beside his handler. His steady breathing and calm eyes belied the storm raging in the courtroom. At first glance, he looked like any other service dog, disciplined, silent, waiting for command. But to the boy, Rex was not just a police canine. He was the savior who had lunged into the darkness on that terrible night, a living shield between him and danger. The jurors occasionally glanced at the dog, but most didn't fully grasp his significance. To them, he was evidence in fur, a piece of the puzzle the prosecution could point toward. Yet to the family, and especially the boy, Rex was more than that. He was proof that truth had teeth, loyalty, and a heartbeat. The handler, Officer Daniels, shifted slightly in his seat. He had worked with Rex for nearly 6 years, training, through rain, heat, and sleepless nights. Together, they had tracked fugitives, sniffed out narcotics, and located missing children. But nothing had bonded them quite like that night at the small suburban home. Daniels remembered it vividly. The radio call had come in just after midnight. Possible break-in, family inside. The urgency in the dispatcher's voice had sent adrenaline racing through his veins. Rex had whined softly in the back seat of the cruiser, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. When they arrived, Daniels hadn't hesitated. He gave the command, and Rex burst forward with explosive speed. The sound of shattered glass still hung in the air when they entered the home. Daniels could hear a woman's sobs, the faint squeak of a child, and the heavy thud of an intruder's boots on the floorboards. And then Rex had leapt. The image was burned into Daniels' memory, his partner's muscles rippling as he lunged, teeth snapping inches from the crowbar. The suspect swung, but Rex dodged, forcing him backward, buying Daniels enough time to rush in and subdue the man. Behind the couch, Daniels had glimpsed a small boy clutching a red toy car, his eyes enormous in the dim light. The look of awe and terror in that child's face haunted Daniels even now. Back in the courtroom, the boy's eyes found Rex instantly. His shoulders, tense moments before, eased the moment he saw the dog. A shy smile tugged at his lips, and for the first time since entering, he seemed safe. It was as if the presence of the silent guardian reminded him of that night, not the fear, but the protection. The defense attorney noticed the boy's reaction and scowled. He leaned toward his client, whispering sharply, clearly displeased at the connection forming before the jury's eyes. To him, the dog was a prop, nothing more, and he intended to minimize its effect. The judge, however, leaned forward curiously. "Officer Daniels," he said, addressing Rex's handler, "approach the stand." Daniels rose, Rex padding beside him with obedient grace. Every step the dog took seemed deliberate, his nails clicking softly against the polished wood floor. The jurors followed him with their eyes, some with curiosity, others with admiration. On the stand, Daniels recounted the night with precision. He explained Rex's training, his certifications, the countless hours of drills that prepared him for moments exactly like that. Rex is trained to protect, to neutralize threats, and to preserve life, Daniels said firmly. That night, he did all three. The prosecutor nodded approvingly, knowing this testimony reinforced the credibility of the boy's memory. But the defense attorney rose quickly for cross-examination. "Officer Daniels," he began, voice dripping with skepticism. "Dogs act on instinct, don't they? They don't process truth. They don't understand crime. They don't testify." Daniels narrowed his eyes. "No," he replied evenly. "They don't testify, but they protect. And when a child points to the dog who saved his life, that's not instinct, it's recognition." The courtroom murmured, the defense attorney faltering for a moment under the weight of Daniels' conviction. He pressed on weakly, but every answer from the handler only strengthened the image of Rex as more than just a tool. Meanwhile, the boy's gaze never left the dog. His tiny fingers stopped fidgeting with the toy car, and he sat straighter, braver. For a 3-year-old, courage wasn't something explained in speeches or taught in classrooms. It was something felt. And right then, he felt it in the steady brown eyes of the German Shepherd. The judge glanced at the child, then back at Rex. For the first time in his long career, he seemed to wrestle with the strange reality that a dog, without ever speaking a word, could serve as a pillar of truth in a courtroom. The tension deepened. Everyone knew what was coming next. The boy would be asked to speak about that night. His words, however few, could either shatter the defense's wall of doubt or crumble under its weight. But what no one expected was how the boy would bridge that moment, not by looking at the lawyers, or the judge, or even his mother. His courage would rise when his eyes met Rex's, when the silent guardian reminded him that he had been protected once before, and that speaking now would be another way of standing safe in the dog's shadow. The defense attorney sank into his chair, frustrated. He could attack evidence, he could twist testimony, but he could not break the invisible bond forming between a boy and a dog. That bond was becoming something larger than strategy. It was becoming undeniable truth. And so, with Rex lying quietly on the floor, tail curled neatly around his paws, the courtroom prepared for the moment of truth. A child's testimony was no longer just about memory. It was about trust. Trust in what he saw, trust in what he felt, and trust in the silent guardian who had already proven his loyalty once before. The stage was set, the silence heavy. The next voice to rise would be the smallest in the room. Yet with Rex there, steady as stone, it might also prove to be the strongest. The courtroom had fallen into a hush so deep it almost seemed unnatural. Papers no longer rustled, reporters had stopped scribbling, and even the creaking of benches seemed to have disappeared. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the smallest figure. In the room, the 3-year-old boy perched awkwardly on the witness chair. His legs dangled far above the floor, his red toy car clutched tightly in his hand. The judge, normally stern and commanding, softened his voice as he leaned forward. "Hello, young man," he said gently, his tone more like a grandfather than a figure of authority. "Do you remember why you're here today?" The boy looked up, blinking, his lip quivering for a brief moment. His mother shifted anxiously in her seat, silently urging him to be brave. She knew her son didn't fully understand courtrooms, juries, or the concept of guilt. But he understood something else, the difference between safety and danger, between the night he clung to her in fear and the moment Rex had saved them both. The prosecutor stepped closer, crouching slightly so that he was at the child's eye level. He smiled warmly. "Can you tell us your name?" he asked. The boy whispered it, so softly that the court reporter had to lean forward to catch it. His small voice barely carried across the microphone, yet the jurors leaned forward instinctively, as if afraid to miss a single syllable. The defense attorney crossed his arms, rolling his eyes. To him, this was all theater. He was waiting for the child to stumble, to become confused, to prove his point that such a young witness could not be trusted. But the prosecutor pressed on carefully, each question slow and simple. "Do you remember something happening at your house one night?" The boy nodded, his tiny fingers gripping the toy car tighter. "Bad man," he whispered, his voice slightly louder this time. The room seemed to hold its breath. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, realizing the impact even those two words carried. The boy had not been led. He had not been prompted with names or details. He had simply spoken from memory. "Can you tell us what you saw?" The prosecutor asked softly. The boy hesitated, eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. The tall adults in suits, the looming judge, the strangers staring at him, all of it was overwhelming. For a moment, his lower lip trembled again, and then it seemed as though he might retreat into silence. Then his gaze fell on Rex. The German shepherd lay at ease near Officer Daniels, his brown eyes calm and steady, ears twitching slightly at the sound of the boy's voice. To the child, Rex wasn't just a dog. He was safety wrapped in fur, the one who had leapt between him and danger. The boy's shoulders straightened. His fear ebbed just enough to give him courage. He raised his small hand and pointed toward Rex. His voice, though high and childlike, rang with a sudden clarity that silenced the courtroom. "Doggy saved me. Doggy caught the bad man." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Simple yet powerful. No legal jargon, no elaborate testimony, just the unshaken truth from the mouth of a child. The jurors sat stunned. Some glanced at each other, wide-eyed. The boy's mother covered her face with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, momentarily speechless. In all his years on the bench, he had rarely seen a statement so pure, cut through the layers of argument and strategy that usually clouded trials. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection!" He barked, his voice trembling with urgency. "This is hearsay. This is nonsense. He's a child. He's been coached." The judge slammed his gavel down, silencing him. "Sit down, counselor. The court will decide what weight to give this testimony." But it was too late. The boy's words had already pierced the hearts of the jurors. Innocence carried its own kind of authority, one that lawyers could not easily dismantle. The prosecutor allowed the silence to stretch, knowing that nothing he could say would strengthen the moment. He simply placed a hand gently on the witness. Stand nodded reassuringly to the boy and whispered, "Thank you." The child smiled faintly, proud in the way only a 3-year-old could be. To him, it was simple. He had seen a bad man, and he had seen Rex save him. There was no strategy, no exaggeration, just truth. The jurors scribbled furiously in their notebooks, though most seemed too shaken to write much. One woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A man in the back row leaned forward, his jaw tight, as though wrestling with the weight of what he had just heard. Rex shifted slightly, his ears perking again, as if he understood he had just been named. His handler rested a hand on his leash, pride swelling quietly in his chest. He knew his partner had done his duty that night, but seeing the child credit him with those simple, powerful words, it was more than validation. It was vindication. The defense attorney slumped into his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating. He knew the jury had felt the shift. The boy's testimony was short, yes, but it carried a raw honesty that no cross-examination could undo. Every word he tried to speak now would only sound like an attack on innocence, and that was a battle he could not win. The judge finally broke the silence. The witness may step down." His voice was quieter than usual, tinged with a respect he rarely displayed in his courtroom. The boy hopped down from the chair with his toy car still clutched in his fist. His mother swept him into her arms the moment he reached her, kissing his forehead and whispering, "You did so good, sweetheart." The gallery buzzed with hushed whispers, reporters scribbling furiously. Headlines were already being drafted in their minds. 3-year-old stuns courtroom with testimony. Child points to police dog as hero. And though the trial was not yet over, everyone inside the courtroom knew something had changed forever in that moment. The boy's tiny voice had tipped the scales. It wasn't the length of his testimony, nor the detail, it was the unshaken certainty, the innocence that cut straight through doubt. For the first time since the trial began, the prosecution had more than evidence. They had the jury's hearts. And all it had taken was a child's small finger pointing toward a silent guardian, and 5 words spoken with the weight of truth. "Doggy saved me. Doggy caught the bad man." The boy's words still lingered in the air, like the echo of a bell that refused to fade. "Doggy saved me. Doggy caught the bad man." It was so simple, so undeniable, that the entire courtroom remained paralyzed long after he had been escorted back to his mother's arms. Reporters had stopped scribbling mid-sentence, their pens frozen above their notebooks. Jurors stared blankly ahead, as if they had just witnessed something that no legal instruction could erase. The defense attorney's jaw tightened. He forced himself to stand, though the weight of the moment made it feel as though his legs were filled with sand. He straightened his suit jacket, trying to project confidence, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of desperation. He turned sharply to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking before he steadied it. "The testimony we just heard cannot be given the same credibility as an adult witness. This is a toddler, barely able to string together sentences, and yet we are expected to believe he understands what he saw." His words hung heavy, but they lacked the power they might have carried minutes earlier. The courtroom had heard the boy's tiny voice. They had seen the conviction in his eyes, the instinctive way he pointed at Rex without hesitation. There was no sign of coaching, no rehearsed story, just truth. The prosecutor rose calmly, not needing theatrics. "Your Honor, the law allows for witnesses of all ages, so long as the court finds them competent." The child understood the difference between truth and a lie. He recalled what he experienced. That is all that is required. The jury can weigh his words for themselves. The judge rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his eyes drifting to the jury box. He had presided over countless trials, but he could feel what everyone else in the room felt, that a shift had occurred. Still, he had to maintain order. "The objection is noted," he said at last, "but the testimony will stand. The jury may consider it alongside all other evidence." The defense attorney sat down heavily, his face pale. He knew the damage was done. The jurors were no longer looking at him the same way. Their eyes were softer, yet sharper at the same time, soft with sympathy toward the boy, sharp with suspicion toward his client. Rex stirred at the sound of the gavel, his ears flicking back. The German shepherd's steady presence seemed to anchor the entire courtroom. Even those who had entered skeptical of police dogs now looked at him with a newfound respect. He was no longer just evidence. He was a living hero in their eyes, confirmed by the smallest witness imaginable. The mother rocked her son gently, whispering reassurances into his hair. Her hands trembled, though not from fear this time. For weeks she had dreaded this moment, terrified that her little boy would falter, that the courtroom would be too intimidating. Instead, he had carried more weight with 5 words than any adult testimony could. The prosecutor returned to his table, flipping through his notes. He didn't need them anymore. He knew the case had turned. The evidence had been strong already. The broken lock, the the stolen property recovered, Rex's pursuit and capture of the suspect. But evidence was cold, clinical. Now the jury had something else. Emotion, raw and undeniable. The child's innocence had fused with the facts, and together, they created a narrative that no defense could untangle. The jurors whispered among themselves when the judge called for a short recess. They weren't supposed to discuss the case yet, but body language betrayed everything. One leaned back, nodding slowly to himself. Another pressed her lips together, tears welling as she glanced at the boy. A third stared at Rex, as though silently acknowledging that the dog's testimony had already been given through the child. The defense attorney used the break to huddle with his client, his gestures sharp and frantic. "We're in trouble," he hissed under his breath. "The jury is gone. That boy, he didn't just testify. He branded you in their minds. To them, you're the bad man. You're done unless we change strategy." The defendant, a gaunt man in his 30s, sneered bitterly. "So what? I'm supposed to lose to a toddler and a mutt?" His arrogance had carried him this far, but even he felt the sting of that tiny voice echoing in his ears. The lawyer shook his head. Defeated. It's not about losing to a toddler. It's about losing to the truth. And right now, the truth is against us. When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. The defense attorney tried to recover ground, but his cross-examination of the officers felt hollow. Every question sounded strained. Every attempt at casting doubt rang false. The jury wasn't buying it anymore. They kept glancing back toward the boy and his mother, toward Rex, toward the memory of those 5 words. The prosecutor, sensing victory but cautious not to gloat, pressed forward. With quiet confidence, he emphasized facts already established: the broken door, the footprints, the suspect's DNA on the stolen items. Each fact now seemed stronger, supported by the emotional core of the child's testimony. Reporters leaned forward eagerly, already drafting tomorrow's headlines. Toddler tips scales of justice. Tiny voice, big impact. Police dog named hero in courtroom. The judge himself couldn't shake the image. He found his mind drifting back to the boy's trembling hand pointing toward Rex. For all his years, presiding over complex arguments, motions, and legal jargon, it was a reminder that sometimes truth required no embellishment. As the afternoon wore on, tension thickened. Every word spoken in that courtroom was being weighed against the moment that had already decided the jury's hearts. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his earlier swagger gone. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the power of a child who had never intended to destroy him, only to tell the truth. By the time the judge adjourned for the day, the atmosphere was no longer uncertain. The jurors filed out with the weight of decision heavy on their shoulders, but their expressions told the story. They had heard all they needed to. The boy's testimony wasn't just evidence. It was a verdict waiting to be delivered. The defense attorney slumped into his chair, head in his hands. The prosecutor gathered his notes, a small smile flickering across his face as he glanced at Rex. The dog remained calm, regal, as if unaware of the storm he had helped weather. The boy was carried out by his mother, his toy car still clutched in his tiny fist. He didn't know the power of what he had done, didn't understand that his words had just dismantled an entire defense strategy. To him, he had only told the truth about his hero. And in the silence left behind, the truth echoed louder than any gavel could strike. The courthouse was buzzing the next morning long before proceedings began. Reporters lined the steps outside, cameras flashing as lawyers hurried in. The air inside was even heavier, thick with anticipation. The trial had reached its final stage. Closing arguments. Everyone knew what was coming. The boy's testimony lingered like a shadow over every corner of the room, shaping the day before a single word had been spoken. Rex sat at attention beside his handler, his brown eyes calm, but alert. To him, this was just another day among humans who seemed endlessly restless. Yet to those humans, his presence carried extraordinary weight. He was no longer simply a K-9 officer. He was the quiet, steady heartbeat of the case. The jury's eyes drifted to him even before the lawyers stood, as though silently acknowledging him as part of the evidence. The judge gavelled the court to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now hear closing statements. Remember, what you hear is not evidence, but arguments. You are to weigh them against the facts presented. The prosecutor rose first, his posture confident but not overbearing. He carried no notes this time. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man who knew he didn't need theatrics to win. He walked slowly toward the jury box, his hands folded loosely in front of him. You have heard many things in this courtroom, he began. You've seen photographs, heard from officers, examined physical evidence. You've heard how Rex, a trained police K-9, pursued and apprehended the defendant after the burglary. And you've heard from the smallest witness imaginable, a 3-year-old boy. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Jurors shifted in their seats, leaning forward unconsciously. That boy didn't speak in legal terms. The prosecutor continued. He didn't try to interpret the evidence. He simply told the truth the way only a child can. Doggy saved me. Doggy caught the bad man. That wasn't rehearsed. That wasn't fabricated. It was raw, honest memory. He gestured gently toward Rex, and you saw who he pointed to when he said doggy. You saw his little hand tremble as he identified the very dog who protected him. You saw his courage, standing in this intimidating courtroom, facing strangers, yet still choosing to tell the truth. The jurors nodded slightly, their expressions serious. The image of the boy pointing at Rex had been replaying in their minds for days. This case, the prosecutor said firmly, is not about complicated loopholes. It's not about technicalities. It's about truth. And truth has been shown to you in multiple forms. Physical evidence, officer testimony, and yes, even the pure, unshakable words of a child. Do not dismiss that truth. Do not let it be drowned by excuses or distractions. Deliver justice. He turned toward the defendant, his tone sharpening. Because when this man broke into that home, when he terrorized that family, he thought no one could stop him. But a police dog did, and a child bore witness. That is justice already at work. Now, it is your duty to finish what has been started. He returned to his seat without further flourish. The simplicity of his delivery made it all the more powerful. The defense attorney stood slowly, shoulders tense. He knew he was walking into a storm. His client glared at him, desperate for salvation, but the lawyer's own confidence had cracked. Days earlier, still, he had no choice but to fight. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, pacing deliberately, you've been shown a very emotional case. You've seen a child testify. And while I do not doubt the sincerity of that child, I ask you, should a toddler's fragmented memory be what decides a man's fate? Should a dog, no matter how well trained, be treated as the ultimate witness? He spread his arms wide, attempting to appeal to reason. We live in a nation where evidence must be beyond reasonable doubt. I ask you, is there room here for doubt? The boy may have been confused. Children at that age can mistake what they see. The officers themselves admitted the boy was terrified that night. Fear can alter memory. His words were carefully chosen, but his tone betrayed strain. Jurors remained polite, but their eyes were unmoved. He pressed harder, his voice rising. And Rex, yes, Rex pursued my client. But a dog cannot testify. We cannot know if Rex identified the right man out of instinct or confusion. Dogs are loyal. Yes. Dogs are courageous. Yes. But they are not infallible. It was his last card to play, cast doubt on the infallibility of a dog and the clarity of a child. But the jurors' faces told the story. They weren't buying it. The boy's sincerity had cut through doubt like a blade. The defense attorney's words sounded hollow against the echo of truth already delivered. He tried to soften his tone for the finish. I urge you to remember that this is a man's life. Do not let sentiment cloud judgment. Do not let a child's innocent words outweigh your duty to fairness. If there is any doubt, and I submit that there must be, you cannot convict. He sat down heavily, avoiding his client's furious glare. The judge dismissed the jury for deliberation. As they filed out, silence filled the courtroom. Everyone knew this would not be a long wait. The jurors' minds had been made up when the boy pointed at Rex. The defendant leaned back, muttering curses under his breath. His bravado had drained, leaving only bitterness. His attorney rubbed his temples, already preparing for the inevitable. Across the room, the boy's mother held him close, whispering praise for his bravery. He had fallen asleep in her arms. Blissfully unaware of the storm he had calmed with his innocence. The prosecutor petted Rex gently, leaning down to whisper, "Good work, partner. Justice is almost here." Reporters scribbled furiously, already shaping headlines. Words like hero dog, tiny witness, and stunned jury filled their notebooks. They could sense history in the making, a story that would echo far beyond this. Courtroom. Hours later, as night fell outside the courthouse, the jury sent word. They had reached a verdict. The judge called everyone back to their seats. Heartbeats quickened. The boy stirred awake, rubbing his eyes as though sensing something important was about to happen. Rex shifted, ears pricking at the sudden tension in the room. The foreperson stood, holding a folded piece of paper. The judge nodded for the verdict to be read. And in that suspended moment, when time itself seemed to hold its breath, the entire courtroom leaned forward, waiting to hear whether the truth, spoken by a child and reinforced by a loyal dog, would be enough to deliver justice. The courtroom was hushed to the point of stillness. Even the reporters who normally whispered and shuffled their papers seemed frozen, waiting for the words that would soon define everything. The foreperson of the jury, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, stood clutching the folded verdict slip in her hands. Her knuckles were pale from the pressure of her grip. The judge's voice, calm but grave, cut through the silence. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension. She handed the paper to the bailiff, who walked it over to the judge. The judge opened it, scanned it silently, then gave a slow nod. "Will the defendant please rise?" The man stood reluctantly, his posture defiant, but his eyes darting with nervousness. The defense attorney rose with him, though his shoulders sagged as though already bearing the weight of defeat. Across the room, the boy stirred in his mother's arms, rubbing his sleepy eyes and peeking curiously at the scene unfolding before him. Rex, sensing the height of the moment, sat taller, ears pricked, gaze fixed. The judge's voice filled the chamber. In the case of the state versus Daniel Harris on the charge of aggravated burglary, the jury finds the defendant guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, the jury finds the defendant guilty. On the charge of assaulting an officer, the jury finds the defendant guilty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed immediately by a swell of whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching against paper like thunder. The defendant clenched his fists, muttering curses under his breath, while his attorney closed his eyes briefly in resignation. The judge's gavel came down hard. Order in the court. The boy's mother held him tighter, tears glistening in her eyes. The little one looked up at her and whispered softly, "Is the bad man gone?" His mother nodded, unable to speak through the lump in her throat. He leaned his head against her shoulder, comforted by an answer too big for him to truly understand. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, relief written across his face. He glanced down at Rex and patted the dog's head gently. "We did it, partner," he whispered. Rex gave a small, almost imperceptible wag of his tail, as though acknowledging the sentiment. The judge looked sternly at the defendant. "Mr. Harris, you have been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will occur at a later date. You are hereby remanded into custody." 2 deputies moved swiftly, cuffing the man as he struggled briefly, shouting his protests. "This is all lies. A dog and a kid? That's what you used to put me away?" His voice was venomous, echoing through the chamber. But no one paid him mind. The truth had spoken, and the truth had been accepted. The jury was dismissed, thanked by the judge for their service. Many of them, however, lingered with their eyes drifting toward the boy and Rex. It was rare for jurors to feel affection for witnesses, but this case was unlike any they'd seen. A few even smiled warmly, offering silent acknowledgement of the courage they had witnessed. When the formalities ended, the courthouse loosened into chatter. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones held high. Yet, surprisingly, their attention wasn't only on the lawyers or the case, it was on the boy and Rex. "Tiny hero saves the day," one journalist muttered as she wrote her headline. Another leaned toward his colleague. "People are going to eat this story up." A toddler pointing at a dog? That's history. The boy's mother shielded him from the barrage of attention, whispering, "Let's go home." But the prosecutor approached gently, crouching so he was at eye level with the child. "You were very brave," he said softly. "You told the truth when it mattered most. Do you know what that means?" The boy blinked, thumb in his mouth, unsure of what to say. The prosecutor smiled. "It means you helped keep people safe. You helped Rex do his job. That makes you a hero." The child glanced at Rex, who was watching calmly with his steady gaze. The boy giggled and reached out, patting Rex's head. "Good doggy." Rex licked his tiny hand once, a rare display of affection that drew collective smiles from those who saw. In that moment, the tension that had hung heavy for weeks dissolved into something lighter, something hopeful. Days later, the story dominated headlines across the nation. News outlets ran segments titled "Tiny Voice, Huge Impact," and "The Boy Who Pointed at Justice." Pictures of the child reaching toward Rex filled newspapers and television screens. Social media overflowed with messages of admiration. People were stunned not just by the case, but by the unlikely duo who had delivered the truth, a toddler and a police dog. The defendant's sentencing came weeks later, resulting in a lengthy prison term. The courtroom wasn't as packed that day, but for the family and the officers involved, closure had finally come. Yet the story didn't end there. Rex received a special commendation for his service, awarded in a ceremony attended by both officers and civilians. When the little boy was invited to stand beside him, the crowd erupted in applause. The boy wore a small police cap that dwarfed his head, and when asked if he wanted to be an officer when he grew up, he answered with childlike certainty, "I want to be like Doggy." The prosecutor, watching from the side, felt a rare swell of emotion. Justice had been served, yes, but something greater had been achieved. The reaffirmation that truth can come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it doesn't roar, it whispers. Sometimes it doesn't stride, it toddles. And sometimes it doesn't wear a badge, it wears fur. The boy's mother later reflected in an interview, "People think children don't understand, but my son understood one thing very clearly. He knew who kept him safe. And he wasn't afraid to say it." That courage, coupled with Rex's unwavering loyalty, became more than just a case. It became a story told in training academies, in schools, even in family homes, where parents reminded their children that telling the truth matters, no matter how small you are. As for Rex, he returned to duty with his handler, continuing his role as protector. But among the officers, his reputation grew larger than life. He was no longer just a K9. He was the dog who stood silently while a toddler pointed at him and spoke the simplest words that carried the greatest weight. For the boy, he grew older, carrying no vivid memory of the courtroom, just faint fragments. But his family kept the story alive for him. They kept the newspaper clippings, the photos, the commendation ceremony. They told him often, "You were braver than you'll ever know." Years later, when he was asked about it as a teenager, he would smile shyly and say, "I don't remember much. Just that Rex was my hero." And so it remained a legacy born from innocence and loyalty, proof that sometimes justice doesn't need to be shouted. Sometimes it's spoken by the smallest of voices, pointed with the tiniest of fingers, and carried on the silent paws of a steadfast friend.